My topic is the exposure triangle. Okay, next. What is this about? I'm going to talk about three variables. This is photography 101. The three variables that determine exposure, and these are the lens aperture, number one, the shutter speed, number two, and the sensitivity of the sensor, number three. Next. Here's what I would like to discuss. First of all, what is each variable and how does it affect the exposure? Second, what else does this variable affect? You will see the depth of field, the sharpness. How are these three variables set in a modern camera that we use today? An interesting question, is one of those three settings more important for stereophotography than the rest? And all this discussion will lead me to the main point. What's the best mode to use our cameras today? And also, is there any reason to use anything else than automatic mode, which I suspect most people are using today? Okay? Next. Okay, in this schematic, I'm trying to show where the variables are located in the camera lens system. So you have the lens in the front, a light goes through the lens, and the lens has an aperture, which is an opening, and this controls the amount of light that will go through. In the back, we have a shutter. When you press the shutter button of your camera, the shutter opens and closes and lets light go through. So that determines the time of exposure, what affects the exposure. And at the end, we have the film or the sensor, and the sensitivity, how sensitive the sensor is to the light, also affects the exposure. So here are your three variables. And now we're going to take a closer look to each one of them. Let's start with the aperture. I told you that the aperture is the opening of the lens, and the way that's measured is using f-stops. Actually, it's a little bit more complicated. It's a ratio of the focal length over the opening of the lens. And this f-stop is just a number because you're dividing two lengths. Now, there's a scale of apertures that's being used, and one way to reproduce the scale is you write down the number 1 and then the square root of 2, which is 1.4. So you write down 1 and 1.4, and then you double 1, you get 2, and then you double 1.4, you get 2.8, 2.4, and so on and so forth. And by the way, you can go past 22. And Rick, what would the next number be? 32 will be 16 times 2. The next number is 32. And you can go under 1. There's no reason the scale starts at 1. But it's difficult to make lenses that have such a high f-stop, or sometimes called f-ratio. So usually a lens is like 1.4. It's considered a fast lens. Admits a lot of light when it's wide open. Now, this ratio, the way it's constructed, when you have a bigger aperture of the lens, this ratio is smaller because you see in the case the focal length over the lens opening. So a large lens opening will give you a smaller number. Over here, I put the numbers in a schematic. On the right side, you have a wide aperture, and this has a small f ratio, okay? And that admits a lot of light. Now, one question you might ask is, why does it go by the square root of 2? Going from one f-stop to the next would double the amount of light, but why is the square root of 2 and not just times 2? That's because the amount of light depends on the surface. And when you double the diameter of the aperture, the surface increases by 4 times. So if you increase the diameter by square root of 2, then the surface would double and the amount of light would double. That's why the scale looks like this. So on the right side, big aperture, small f ratio. On the left side, you have a small opening and a large f-stop. Now, what else does the aperture affect? It affects the depth of field. When the aperture is wide open, things can be out of focus. When you go on the left side and the aperture is small, things are in focus. So when I first learned about this thing, I created myself as a way to remember that small apertures means sharp pixels. So what I do is I make a little aperture with my fingers. So I defocus my eyes completely, and then I make a little aperture, and I look through, and everything is sharp. Everything is sharp because I'm looking through a very small hole. Okay, over here I'm showing the stereorealist. Do you remember the stereorealist? It has a nice ring that you turn, and the aperture numbers are around the lens. And this is another lens here. Right now it's sitting at f5.6, I think. I see the maximum aperture 1.4 for this lens here. Well, it happens that today most cameras do not have aperture rings anymore. But I do have one here. This is my Sony RX1, and there's a nice aperture for the lens. Okay, this is rare to have. Well, not so rare. Some of the bigger cameras, they still have aperture rings. Okay, let's go to the next picture. Since I mentioned depth of field, that the aperture affects the depth of field, I might as well tell you what the depth of field is. This guy here, the photographer, is taking a picture of this girl, and it's focused on the girl, okay? So the girl is sharp, but also there's an area in front of the girl and behind the girl that's acceptably sharp, okay? That's the way they call it, acceptably sharp. Then the photographer here, he closes the aperture, so he puts a smaller opening, large F ratio. Then the depth of field increased, and now the dog here and the tree in the back are also in focus. The depth of field increased. And by the way, to the focus point, there's less of field in the front and more in the back. So that's how the depth of field works, and it's important for us in stereophotography. Why? To have everything sharp. Okay, next. And now I want to mention another concept that's important for stereophotography, is the hyperfocal distance. We're back to stereorealism. Okay, so let's say the photographer takes a picture of a scene. There's something in the foreground, this little bush here, and there's a tree at infinity, a mountain at infinity. If he focuses on the near object, he might throw the infinity out of focus. If he focuses at infinity, then he might throw the front object out of focus. So where should he focus? Or somewhere in between. There is, what's the definition of the hyperfocal? If you have a distance, you have half this distance to infinity, they get the maximum depth of field. When I deal with people using a stereorealist, I tell them, don't worry about the focusing. I focus at 15 feet, no matter what's happening. If you focus at 15 feet, you have everything from 7 feet to infinity in focus. The problem with modern cameras is they have autofocus. Where exactly are you focusing? Stereophotography tends to favor manual focusing and hyperfocal distance. And by the way, those lenses here, they have depth of field marks in them, something that we don't see more often. The stereorealist has a depth of field. Next. Let's move to the next quantity, which is the shutter speed. Okay, the shutter speed. This how fast the shutter opens and closes, and it's measured by the amount of time that the shutter is open. That's the exposure time. The longer the shutter is open, the more light goes through and exposes our sensor. Now, normally this time is pretty small. It's a fraction of a second. So in this scale over here at the top, the slowest shutter speed is half a second, and then it goes quarter second, 8 seconds, and the fastest shutter speed over here is 1,000 of a second in this scale. When you see those markings, normally they omit the fraction just to conserve space. This is a shutter dial, and when it says 100, you can bet it's 100th of a second. It's not 100 seconds, okay? It's 100th of a second, but they omit it just so that it fits in the dial. Now, again, going from one point to the other, the light, the exposure is either doubled or cut in half. So what else does the shutter speed affect in addition to the amount of light? It affects something called motion blur. If something is moving and you use a slow shutter speed, as you see in the schematic, like a guy's running, it's going to be blurred. On the left side, if you're using fast shutter speed, you're going to freeze this motion. Okay, that's why the shutter speed is important. Over here, there's a classification. It tells you, like, if you're 500 of a second, 1,000, and you can go even higher, then you're talking about fast speeds. Here you have the motor speeds. Normally, that's when you hold the camera. And over here, you have slow speeds, starting from 1/15 of a second. Here, you might need to use a tripod. And then you have very slow speed. And I mentioned that this is the shutter dial. The stereo realist has it. Some cameras have it. My Sony doesn't have it. That has been thrown from most cameras. The shutter speed dial. So how do you change the shutter speed if there's no dial? You go in a menu, right? There's a menu somewhere that you can change the shutter speed. Okay, I mentioned that the shutter speed will affect the motion of an object, but there are two kinds of motions. The subject is moving, and also you're moving. When you hold the camera, you think you're holding steady, but you're shaking it a little bit. So that brings me to the next question. What is the minimum hand-holding speed? In other words, if I give you the stereo realist or if you the Fuji, right? The question is, well, how slow can the shutter speed be and comfortably, safely hold it without shaking it, okay? Well, there's an old rule of thumb, this is pretty old, that it says that the safe hand-holding speed is 1 over the focal length. Now, that's just the rule of thumb. If you see the units are, this is time and this is 1 over length, but somebody noticed that if I increase the focal length, well, I need to use faster shutter speed. They saw the connection, okay? So for example, if you're using a 50mm lens, the minimum hand-holding speed is 1/50th of a second, or let's say 1/6 of a second, okay? If you use a 500mm lens, which is a big telephoto lens, the minimum hand-holding speed is 1/500th of a second. Now, why the difference? When you use a long lens, you're magnifying everything, including magnifying you shaking the camera. As I said, that's a rule. Some people can hold the camera steadier than others. As you get older, your hands are shaking. Now, there are two things I need to mention, though. Technology brought us something called image stabilization that some cameras, some lenses have. And this is measured by steps. So in this example of 50mm lens, that normally you need to use 1/60th of a second. It has, let's say it has 3 steps of image stabilization. That means you can go 1/30, that's one step, 1/15 of a second, another step, 1/8 of a second, that's the third step. You can use this lens at 1/8 of a second and get sharp pictures. That's amazing. That's an amazing feature. So, okay, which cameras have it? Well, I made a list. The Fuji doesn't have image stabilization. The Panasonic 3D1 does. That's why I say that this camera is better for low light photography than the Fuji. Most modern digital cameras have image stabilization. And here I have my $4,000, $4,000 when new, Sony RX1, and it doesn't have image stabilization, which bothers me. I'm gonna tell you things that bother me. This is the first thing that bothers me. Like, wait, I pay $4,000 and a $100 camera will have image stabilization, and this does, like, why? Is there some magic sauce there? I mean, like, why? That bugs me because now I have to use high shutter speeds. Yes. Sure, the weight and how well trained you are in lifting weights. Yeah, some people say that the lighter the camera, the more chance to shake it. The same with binoculars. They say the heavier is a little bit more steady. Yeah, the little factor. So that's just the rule of thumb. Yes. Right. I have to. I'm forced to. Now, something else is the concept of the effective focal length. Look at those two pictures. I took this one with the Sony camera. It has a 35mm fixed lens. You cannot zoom. It's 35mm clear. So I'm standing here and I'm seeing the train coming. I take this picture. Then I go home and I blow this picture like 5 times, right? And wow, I love this. I love this. Oh, the train is coming out of the trees. So I'm crop it and I enlarge it. What I've done essentially is I've increased the focal length. This picture here has an effective focal length of 170mm. When I was standing here, if I could zoom at 170mm, I would have taken exactly this picture. So now my effective focal length is different. And when you apply this rule, 1/35 is not safe if I'm going to blow things up like this. I need 1/170 to be safe. So have this in mind. You have to be conservative. So when I use my expensive RX1 without image stabilization, normally I use 125 as my minimum handheld shutter speed because I might blow things up. Okay, good. Next, and the third variable is the sensor sensitivity. That's the easiest one. A scale is used to measure this, and there have been different scales historically, but now everybody uses this one called the ISO. Now there's some controversy on how if it's ISO or ISO. Some people say ISO as if it's initial, and they say, well, it's International Standard Organization. No. If you read a little bit about it, that's not correct. The organization is called International Organization for Standard. Yes, and the name of this comes from the Greek word ISO. That's how I would pronounce it. That means equal. So I will say ISO. You will say ISO most likely, and you can say ISO. That's okay. A lot of people say that. So this, now I'm confused. How is it called? Okay, now the ISO has values like 100 is considered low ISO on the left side, 150. Most cameras at the lowest today ISO, they have 100, 200, 400. It goes up to, you know, big numbers here as the sensitivity increases, and you can control this. But, you know, there is no free lunch. If you increase sensitivity, that you get a lot of exposure, you also get a lot of noise, okay? So your goal is in photography to try and stay on the left side and use low ISO values. Next. Great. Now I'm going to put all these three variables in one graph here in a way that on the right side, what do we have? We have a large aperture, we have a slow shutter speed and high sensitivity. All these conditions mean you get a lot of exposure. On the left side, I have a small aperture, fast shutter speed, and low sensitivity, which is less exposure. So now I'm going to ask you a question, okay? If you had a choice to be on the right or on the left, forget about exposure. I'm asking you, would you rather be on the right side or on the left side? Left. I mean, I asked somebody in the meeting and he was like, it depends. Like, no, it doesn't depend. I mean, look at this. Small aperture, everything is in focus. Fast shutter speed, whoops, I froze every motion. Low sensitivity, nice clean picture. So I want to be on the left side for sure. So why don't you go always on the left side? Because you don't have enough light. And to demonstrate this, I mark here with red the sunny day exposure. Okay, I know it by heart by using the Stereographic for many years. It's F16, ISO 100, and shutter speed 1/125. So there's the light. Let me tell you what sunny day means. Okay, think about it. What is a sunny day? Okay, if the sun is above the horizon, 20 degrees, I think, it's a sunny day. Whether you're here in Livonia, Michigan, or you're in Cleveland, Ohio, Athens, Greece, South Africa, New Zealand, wherever you are in the world, it doesn't matter, it's the same exposure. And this is basically the most light you can ever expect to get in natural situation. There is no way to get more light than a sunny day unless if you use artificial light, you know. So basically this red light is a barrier on what you can do. You cannot be on the left side of this line. But you can also have less than a sunny day, as you know, right? Now, one might say, wait, you know, okay, I understand it, but this shutter speed, 125, 1/100, I don't like this because I'm going to photograph action, so I like to go up and be at 1/500 of a second to freeze my action. Can I do that? The answer is yes, you can do that, but now you need to drop something to the right. So you move this step, 2 steps up. You either need to increase your sensitivity by 2 steps, or you need to open the aperture by 2 steps, or you need to do 1 and 1 step, and then your exposure is balanced. Okay? Great. So as long as it's a sunny day, there's no problem, you know, the variables are nice. But what happens when you don't have enough light? Then the question comes up, well, what should I do? And, how should I balance this? So the question pops up, is one of those three more important than the other, or are they all equally important? So let's look at this question. So which setting from those three that I mentioned is more important for 3D photography specifically, not just photography? Well, in one sense, all three are important. Why? Because the aperture is important because we need a depth of field, and that's more important in 3D. 2D photographers can throw the background out of focus. They don't care as long as their subject is in focus. In 3D photography, generally, as a rule, we want everything to be in focus, so that's important for us. The shutter speed is important for both 2D and 3D. You want to freeze motion. There are exceptions to every rule, but basically you don't want blurred pictures. And finally, sensitivity, yes, you want low noise. And I think that's a little bit more important for 3D because when you have different noise patterns or grain patterns, you get to notice it a little bit more because you have two images, one on the right and one on the left. A little bit, but it's important for both 2D and 3D. So I wrote down a strategy for setting those three. First of all, you put an aperture that's small enough that gives you the depth of field that your picture needs, okay? Then you put a shutter speed high enough to freeze any motion in your picture. And finally, you put the lowest ISO that satisfies 1 and 2. It would be a mistake to use very small aperture when you don't need it, very high shutter speed if you don't need them, because that will go at the expense of your third factor. Now with this, I have to tell you a little story here. When I started with the Stereorealist, my first draw, I looked at the pictures and it didn't look sharp to me. And let's say I was using f11 at 1/50, I was keeping notes. And then I thought, you know what? This f11, this is a problem. It doesn't give me sharp pick. I need a smaller aperture. Remember, a smaller aperture. So what I did in the next row, I put f16 and I have to increase the shutter bit 1/25. And what happened? I get even more unsharp pictures. And then I said, what? Okay, I realized what the problem is. I don't hold the camera very steady. So that's my problem. So I have to go the other way. I have to open the aperture and increase the shutter speed if I want to get sharper pictures. So at this point, I learned this lesson here that I'm not afraid of opening the aperture. A lot of people were back in the Stereorealist. And I think the shutter speed, it's okay if you throw some, you don't have the depth of field, but if the whole thing is blurred, you know, then you have a problem, right? So I tend to favor shutter speed over the aperture. And something has happened today. Next, the cameras we use, they tend to have a small sensor. Now I made a diagram there, and the big square is the full frame sensor. That was the 35mm film, and my Sony cameras over there. Many cameras have this kind of sensor, the APS. Here's the Panasonic camera, the Micro Four Thirds. Oh, a lot of cameras, upscale compact, they have the so-called 1-inch sensor, 1-inch in quotations and designations. The Sony RX0, 10, and 100 cameras that I use. And finally, the very small sensor, it happens to be in cameras that we use, like the Fuji, the 3D1, this new little camera, the phone, the small sensor. So what does that affect from our three variables? Mostly it affects the aperture indirectly. And let me try and explain how this works. If you have a camera with a small sensor, it uses a lens with a short focal length. Think of it like geometry. You have a small sensor and the lens is here. If you increase the sensor, the lens will move here and will give you the same, field of view. Well, for example, the Fuji, in the short end, you say it's 35mm lens, but it's not 35mm. That's the equivalent. The actual focal length is 6.5mm. It's pretty small. So that gives you a lot of depth of field because the depth of field depends on the focal length too, not on the aperture. So a short focal length lens has a large, maybe smaller. You must have pressed S. A large depth of field. Good. So it turns out nobody really has seen out of focus use of the Fuji, have you? And the same is true with the phones. The phones actually, they use trickery, I call it, digital manipulation to throw the background out of focus because the lens is small and it cannot do it optically, okay? So here we are, and we don't care so much about the aperture, while the shutter speed still maintains its importance and the sensitivity. Next. And something else has happened today. Nobody really cares about exposure. You see, my presentation is about exposure. Remember when you use film and somebody will show a picture and will say, oh, it's underexposed, overexposed, take a mark off. So it's too dark, means it's underexposed. Today we don't see that very often. Why? Because most cameras use automatic exposure. And then even if you don't like the exposure of your picture, it's very easy to do some editing and change the exposure, right? Lighten up, make it darker, whatever you want. So the exposure is not really a problem today, but the other things, the depth of field, the motion blur, and the noise are still with us. And I want to emphasize here, we're very lucky really in digital photography. When you take a picture, you can look and see what settings the camera used, even if it's using automatic mode. Here's the Fuji, and right here I have the shutter speed, the f-stop, and over there I have the ISO. So all three variables are in the picture. If you hit the display, if they're not in the picture, hit the display, and everything will come in the display. And actually, in many cameras, you can blow the picture up and take a look, make sure everything is okay. So before you go out and take 1,000 pictures of horse races, let's say, and then come home and you realize everything was blurred because your shutter speed was low, just check the first one, see what shutter speed is used, make sure everything's okay before you keep shooting. And you can do it in the field. And then when you go home, you can look at your image and get all the information. It's right there. The way I do it, very simple. I use Windows, and in Windows Explorer, I select a picture, and then I right-click and I click at Properties, okay, and then Details. And look what the computer shows me. It shows me the camera is RX10 Model 4. Wow, I know that. Okay, the aperture is f7.1, great. My exposure time, 1/500 of a second, great. The ISO 100, very good. I use exposure compensation -1/3, fine. The focal length is a 73 here, down here it is 200. 200 is the equivalent. If you were used to focal lengths for full frame cameras, this would be equivalent to 200. I didn't use the flash, how I exposure, whatever. So all the information is there. So make a connection where, it's not sharp enough, and look at the data and see why. Try to understand why this has happened. Okay, next. Well, at some point you might say to me, where's the triangle? Wait, you brought us here in this room to talk about some exposure triangle, and I haven't heard anything about triangles. Well, since you have three quantities here, you can put them at the top of a triangle, which is a fancy presentation, but I really haven't found any practical use for this because any scale you use, the light meters in the cameras, exposure meters, they all have a linear scale. Next. So yeah, the triangles exist and nobody's using them. I mean, in this case, it's one specific exposure here, and it tells you that, if you go this way, you kept something constant, you change something else. Every point in the triangle is a combination of your three variables that give the same exposure. Not very useful for me. And there's your triangle. Next. Okay. Now I'm going to give you a very short history of automatic exposure. In the beginning, the cameras were fully manual, and once you put the roll of film inside, and my favorite film was this one, Fuji 100, your ISO was fixed. So you only have to worry about two variables, the shutter speed and the aperture, right? And then you use the sunny day rule. If it was a sunny day, I would use f16 1/100. And if it wasn't a sunny day, I had a little thing here with all the answers. I tell you, it's cloudy, it's safe, whatever, it tells you what to do. Of course, there were exposure meters. If you want to be very accurate, you can buy one of those and measure things. Well, at some point, the exposure meter came inside the camera. So now you look through the viewfinder and you can see exposure information. At first, it was uncoupled, and then it became coupled, which means the camera now can get the information from the light meter and adjust the exposure. And then people realize, there are a couple of ways to do that. One way, let's call it aperture priority, which means the photographer says, I want to use a specific aperture, let's say f8. Then the camera selects the shutter speed that satisfies the exposure. Or you can have shutter priority. The photographer says, I want 1/500 of a second. And then the camera, depending on the amount of light, will give you an aperture that will give you good exposure. Or the photographer can go to manual mode, which means he sets both on his own and the camera just advises him, okay? And finally, we have automatic mode, sometimes called program mode, where the camera will set both the aperture and the shutter speed, and then you can shoot around happy without worrying. And now you might ask, well, how did the camera decide what to do? Well, if you open your manual, there was a table somewhere that tells you how this program mode works for your camera. And another important automation was the autofocus, okay? And then we made the jump from film to digital. When I got my first digital camera, at first I was thinking digital cameras would be totally different than film cameras, right? I was thinking a totally different animal, but I was surprised to see, whoa, digital cameras have aperture, shutter speed. The only practical difference is the ISO now. I can change it from picture to picture. I'm not stuck with it the minute I put the film in. So now I have 3 variables to worry about, not just 2. Well, and that's where the camera will try to help you next. And the way it will help you to adjust the exposure is through this mode dial. I think the mode dial is the shutter dial became a mode dial. That's why my camera here, my $4,000 camera, doesn't have a shutter dial at the top. There's exposure compensation. There's one dial here, and here's my mode dial right here. Okay, there's no shutter dial. Next, so let's take a look and see. This is a generic mode dial I downloaded from the internet. I'm going to explain what all those things mean. Now, every mode dial has an automatic mode, auto. If you put the dial in this mode, you have no control of anything. The camera will make all the decisions for you, exposure decisions. Yes?
What's the difference between auto and program?
Yes. No, I will explain right now, actually. So after the automatic mode, you have those basic modes that most mode dials have them. PASM are the initials, program, aperture, and manual. So let's say the program. The program is very similar to the auto mode, very similar. You have no control over the shutter speed or the aperture, but you have a few more things that the camera will allow you to control. One of them is the ISO. In program mode, most cameras will allow you to set this if you want. In automatic mode, no, you cannot touch that. It's not available. Also, you have exposure compensation. Exposure compensation means you tell the camera, I see what you're telling me, but I think it's overexposed, so I want to turn the exposure down. I don't care how you do that, what combination of aperture, shutter speed, but I want less exposure. Fine, the camera will give it to you. Again, you don't have exposure compensation in auto mode, only in program mode, and then you can change a few things like white balance, you know. So you have a little bit more control in the program mode, but still it's automatic. And then you have the aperture priority. You set the aperture, camera sets the shutter. Shutter priority, you set the shutter speed, the camera sets the aperture, and then you have the manual where you set both. And you might ask, well, what happened to the third one? Where is my ISO? Well, the ISO in most cameras is its own control. So it's either auto or it's fixed. So you can be in manual mode with the ISO variable, and you can have an automatic exposure, even though you put f8 and 1/500 of a second, the camera selects the sensitivity to give you good exposure, still in automatic mode. But you have the option to fix it. If you fix that, then that's the end of it. You have full control over the exposure. And then over here in this dial, you have those scene modes. What are the scene modes? Well, the scene modes are, let's say, preset exposure modes that use the proper settings depending on the time of scene you're photographing. For example, there's a running guy right here. You see this runner guy? That means sports or action. So if you put the dial here, you're telling the camera, hey, camera, I'm photographing action. So what is the camera going to do? Most likely, it will give you higher shutter speeds, okay? Because that's what action means. You need higher shutter speed. So again, you don't concern yourself with the exact settings. The camera will decide for you, okay? But if it was me, I'd rather go, if I'm doing sports photography, I would rather go in shutter priority mode, put my shutter at 500 a second and see that's good enough. You know, I feel a little bit better knowing, you know, that I know what's going on versus the camera picking some values. Okay, next. Here I'm showing a few more mode dials from my Sony cameras. Now, instead of the scene, you have a button called a setting called scene, and if you go there, you're going to see a menu of all your choices, right? You have panoramic, you have video, you have the standard modes, and then you have MR, which is memory recall, and in this one, which is the RX1, you have 1, 2, 3. So the camera allows you, if you have frequently used settings, to store them in a memory, and every time you turn the dial, let's say number 1, the camera will recall all your settings you were saving under number 1. Okay? Now I know this is the RX100, and there are 2 automatic modes. One is green, and the other has a plus on it. And Sony calls this is auto, and this is intelligent auto. Whoa, wait, you're telling me I can have automatic or intelligent? What would I use plain vanilla auto mode when I can use intelligent auto mode, right? Like, what is the difference? Okay, well, I don't know what the difference is, and you know what? The cameras have gotten so complicated that people are writing books just to tell you what the camera is doing, what all modes do, all the menus do. Like this guy, Alexander White, he's written a book for every Sony I have. So I have all his books. My library is like book. And I read from beginning to the end, and then of course I forget everything. But that's okay. But it's fun to read those books and see what does this camera can do. What does the setting mean? Okay. And finally, there's the very small ones don't even have a mode dial. Why? Because they're trying to be waterproof, and the mode dial is hard to waterproof, so they get rid of it. There's still a button though, and through menus you can pick a mode screen here. You can select whatever you want. So even this camera has the main settings here, but it just doesn't have a mode dial. Okay, all this discussion to lead us to this next question. What's the best mode to use? Well, I made a little flow diagram. This is the way I'm thinking. Maybe you can think the same way as me. The first question I asked is the shutter speed important to you or not? If you're doing sports photography or fireworks, situations where you need very fast or very slow shutter speeds, then you need to control the shutter. If the answer to this question is yes, I'm going to use shutter priority mode because I want to control the shutter speed. If the answer is no, I don't care about the shutter speed. I'm just taking pictures here and there. Okay, fine. So, are you using a compact digital camera? Yes or no? Well, if you're using the Fuji any of those cameras, the answer is yes. So I say, sure, go ahead and use auto mode or program mode, okay? However, when I first got those cameras, I realized that doesn't work. I'll tell you later. So if you're using a full frame camera, I think you need aperture priority to control the depth of field because the camera will tend to ignore it, thinking you're a 2D photographer, doesn't know you're doing 3D. So this is my main flow diagram. And now I'm going to discuss a little bit about the Fuji and the auto mode in general on those cameras. Next. So here's the mode dial for the Fuji. The auto mode is a little red mark, right? Also, there's a program mode. The advanced 3D, extremely useful if you haven't tried. Advanced 2D, I don't know what that is. I don't do anything with 2D. Here's the scene mode. There's something missing here, right? Do you see that something is missing? The name was spasm, and I was like, Pam. Yes, there's no shutter priority in this mode, in this dial mode. Okay, I'll tell you about this later. So you put the dial there, and the camera will take care of everything. Now, how exactly is the camera thinking when it takes care of everything? Well, here's the logic. And by the way, you can investigate this. You take your camera on a sunny day, and you notice what it's using. Then you get in the house when there's less light, and you go in the bathroom when it's even less light, close the door, and see what is this camera doing. And then you get the logic. So basically, what the Fuji and most cameras will do in auto mode, they basically don't care about the aperture because they're small sensors. They know the aperture is not important. And most cases, they will use the widest aperture that the lens has, and then they will only control the shutter speed. If there's a lot of light, perfect. They will have a high shutter speed. As the light drops, they will try to maintain a shutter speed good enough for you not to get blurred pictures when you hold the camera, right? But if the light continues to drop, and they will do this with the lowest ISO possible. As the light drops, they are forced to start raising the ISO, okay? And if the light keeps dropping, then they have to drop the shutter speed. And when that happens, with the Fuji, if they drop the shutter speed, they give you a warning. Warning, you might get blurred pictures. Right now, be careful. Well, guess what? This is exactly the way the logic, this camera's logic is the same logic I would have used. If I was controlling everything, I would have done exactly what this camera is doing. So basically, my point is the auto mode in a compact camera is very good, actually. It does what you expect to do. Now, if you go to one of these modes, like the auto, and you hit the menu button in the Fuji and every camera, you will see how many things you can change. For example, you can change the image size, the aspect ratio, the image quality, you should always have this in fine. The ISO is highlighted. Out of curiosity, I went there and I saw it's always automatic. The only thing you can change is the maximum value. You can tell the camera if you are here, don't go over 800. That's the only control you have. You cannot tell the camera use this value. You can only tell it in the manual mode, don't go over this. And here I'm showing the scene modes from the manual, okay? So, but I have a better idea for you. Instead of using your Fuji in auto mode, I think you should be using program mode. Let me show you the next one. So program mode, right there, does exactly what the auto does, but gives you 3 more controls that you didn't have before. One is exposure compensation. When I use my Fuji, I routinely use -1/3 because I think the Fuji tends to overexpose a little bit. So I put -1/3. Then you can control the ISO. Now, if you go in the menu, you have some more choice. You still have the auto ISO, but you can fix it. 100, 408, 1000, there's more underneath 100. Okay, you can fix it. So second control. And the third control you have, you can change the white balance. Instead of automatic, you use another setting. So those 3 controls, I might as well use them. So I tend to use my Fuji always in the program mode. And most compact cameras, I will use them in a program mode, and then I might adjust one of those 3 things. And just to complete the Fuji here, I went to the manual mode to see what you can do with the Fuji in manual mode. Next. Well, I saw the range of apertures, okay. The range of shutter speed, the slow shutter speed in manual mode is ½ a second. And then I looked at the ISO, and you cannot have an auto ISO in manual mode. You can only fix it. Well, that's a problem. That 2 things bother me. Yeah, okay, let me tell you the 2 things that bother me. First, I look at the shutter speed and I said, really? The camera will not use more exposed than ½ a second? Okay. But then I go into the scene modes and I see that if you select tripod at night, it goes down to 3 seconds. Like, wait. I thought it was maybe some operational problem, but the camera obviously will give you 3 seconds. Then why isn't an option to go in? If I want 3 seconds, I'm forced to go to this scene mode. It should have been there in the manual. I don't know why they do that. And the other thing is, since the dial doesn't allow me to control the shutter, which is the important control, instead of giving me control of the aperture, which is nobody really will need that. So here's a practical situation. Every morning I go, walking with Vinny, the neighbor's dog, and we go on a trail, and they say, then it's early in the morning, there's not enough light. So the camera, I want to make the camera, force the camera to use 100 or 100 of a second speed, okay? Otherwise, I'm going to say, well, with the Fuji, I'm forced to go to manual mode, and then I have no control over the ISO. So if the light changes in the trail, you're in the shade, you're out of the shade, I have to keep fiddling with my things. Why? If I had variable ISO, I could set the aperture at the widest, shutter speed 1/100, and then I let the camera select my ISO to give me good exposure. When I mentioned that, Dennis Green said to me, George, wait, have you tried the sports mode? Well, no, because I don't use scene modes. I think scene modes, they're not very intelligent. But I actually tried, and it turns out it does exactly what I want the camera to do. It will give me higher shutter speeds, which is really what I want. When you go to the sports mode, it won't let you touch the ISO, so you have no control. So the camera will shift things around to give. It's like it's reading your mind. It will give you what you want. So this is how this camera works. In other cameras, I'm able to go to shutter priority mode, and that solves my problem. Okay, next. I want to tell you about shutter control. By controlling, there are many photographic situations that I'm showing here where you use either fast shutter speeds or slow shutter speeds. And they go on the left side is the fast one, on the right side, the slow one. Okay, in these cases, you need to go under shutter priority to control your shutter. Okay, first of all, the fastest shutter speeds, you have birds in flight. Does anybody here try to photograph birds in flight? Well, this is tricky to do in 2D. Now, if you have 2 cameras, I will think twin camera in 2D. Yeah, very hard. It says 1/2000 of a second speed. And then there's a group here called Action Sports Photography. It says 1/500 or 1/1000. Now, there's one guy in this room right here, one of our fellow photographers. He does a lot of sports. photographer. Who's that? Yeah, right here. Rick does a lot of sport. So out of curiosity, all this baseball and the skaters, what's that? You go under shutter priority to take those pictures?
Yeah.
You have to. Okay, what shutter speed do you use? 1,000?
I've been going 1/1200th of a second
Okay. Yep.
for baseball.
Yes. So there you go. You're going to photograph action. You're going to need those fast shutter speeds. The next group is called street photos. It says 1/250. Well, why street photos need higher speed? Because there are people moving, cars moving, and we're also going to add little kids. They're unpredictable, dogs, pets. They're moving, right? When things are moving, you need a little bit higher shutter speed to freeze those things. The next group here is landscapes. Okay, that's interesting. You know, I always wonder, why do landscape photographers use a tripod? You know, if you're outside in the open, open environment, the mountains, there's, bright. Why do you need a tripod? We need just, handhold the camera. Well, I'm going to tell you why. What are they trying to do? The landscape photographer. First of all, those guys are serious about photography. They're not going to go with a $50 digital camera to do landscape photography. They have usually full frame cameras, right? So that's one thing, full frame camera. The second thing they do for sure is they put the ISO at the lowest value. Why? Because they want to get the best pictures they can get. So they put 100. That's the lowest in most cameras. Then when it comes to the aperture, they're not going to use the camera in wide open aperture. They're going to go somewhere in the middle. You know why? First of all, a lot of people claim that the lens has its best performance when it's closed a little bit. Not at the wide open, close it 2 steps, and then the best performance. Also, they might be worried about depth of field. They want to be so they use something like f8. F8 is perfect, right in the middle. Perfect. So they fix the ISO at the lowest value. Then they have an aperture f8. Well, where is the shutter speed now? Well, it depends on the light. Let's say the shutter speed is 1/100th of a second. Let me ask you this. They made all this effort here to get the best pictures. You think they're going to handhold the camera at 1/100th of a second when they can put on a steady rock tripod and get the best possible sharpness? This is what they're going to do. That's why they carry the tripod. Plus, they take pictures at low light, sunsets where they do have low light, and they do need the tripod, blurred waterfalls. So this is what landscape photography is all about. Here we have panning cars, specialty thing. And on the right side, now slow exposure, you have running water, and I don't know why he has 2. I will change one of the 2 and I put night city photography. When I go in a city, it's nice to go out at night and photograph the traffic, whatever the city has to offer at night. Then we have fireworks, 2 to 4 seconds, stars, 15 to 25 seconds, star trails, 15 minutes to hour. Now there's another photographer in this club that does a lot of slow shutter speed pictures. Who's that? Yes, thank you. I mean, you've seen his star trails, right? So he does a lot of, so there you go. Now we're gonna need our 3D glasses to see some of my pictures of those kinds of photography. Okay, now we're sports photography, and this is Vinny, the neighbor's dog that I've been taking out for a hike every morning for over 2 years now. So remember, I went through this phase where I want to photograph Vinny jumping over logs. I know you got tired of these pictures, but okay, now at the top, I see the settings I used. You cannot see them very well, but I'm going to tell you for this picture, it says shutter speed is 1/1000th of a second. And the ISO is 1600. Now, if I was going to change one thing, I don't think this picture needs 1,000th of a second because the dog is running to the picture. If he was running perpendicular, then maybe. He's running 500 would have done it and then drop the ISO to 800. So I would have made this adjustment, but I'm fine. Motion is frozen. And if you use 2 cameras, in those situations, your main concern is if the cameras are synchronized. This is what you worry about. If they're synchronized and if they have fast shutter speed to freeze the motion. Next. Okay, this was a nice day for me. You've seen a few pictures of the same day where I went to this lake and they had acrobatics. So I'm happy with this. I look at the settings, 1/500 of a second, perfect. It froze the action. But, however, the background is a little bit out of focus. I don't know if you can see that. I look at the aperture, f7.1. The reason it's out of focus, I'm using a long focal length, 200 millimeters. If you use long focal lengths or if you're focusing very close, that tends to throw the background out of focus. Now, if I was going to make one change here, I will use f11 to make the background, and the ISO is 100. Well, I have some room to go up. So let's use f11 and 200 or 400. Then I would have the background in focus too. Next. Okay, here I want to make a point. In these pictures like this, where I use the flash, it's actually the duration of the flash that freezes the motion, not the shutter speed. You know, the flash can have a very short duration. It can be 10,000 of a second, and this will freeze everything. Like in this case, even the wings of the bee. Next. Now, this is the panning. I was at the races. I was really at the races, and I had my W3 with me. So the light was going down, and I was kind of had to use the shutter speed like 1/25 of a second. And I noticed, you know, I started panning and trying to follow the horses. And then I managed to get the situation where I get the horse rider sharp and the background is blurred because I'm panning the camera. The shutter speed that you need in these cases is like 1/25, 1/15, something like that. By the way, I entered this in Detroit right here. I entered in Cleveland. I entered in PSA. It's never won anything. Not an award, not nothing. And that was my favorite picture of that day. Maybe now to make it better, I think the background needs to be blurred even more to become like a painting. Other situations, you have cars, you have bicycles, you have a lot of things that move and you can follow them with your camera, okay? Next. Okay, night photography. The way I do the night photography, most likely I will fix the ISO at 100 because I want the cleanest pictures. And because I'm going to use long exposures, I don't need it to be higher. So I fix the ISO at 100, and then I use 3 seconds for this one. 5 seconds, 1 second. So I only change the shutter speed to get the effect I want. And the aperture balances the exposure. The only thing the aperture does is really to balance the exposure. So fix the ISO at the lowest value, change the shutter speed to get the effect that you want, and then let the camera decide in a shutter mode what aperture to use to give you a good exposure. And if you don't like the exposure, you can adjust it. Next. Fireworks. When I first got interested in fireworks, I read somewhere that said that the fireworks exposure is the same as a sunny day exposure, minus the time. You need a long time, which means ISO 100 and aperture f16. That's the sunny day exposure. So f16 or f11, ISO fix it at 100, and then the only thing you change is the time. And the only effect the time has is how many of those bursts you're going to get into the picture. If you increase your exposure time, you get a lot of them in the picture. And by the way, I have to tell you something. You know, I joined the Detroit Club in 1994. And in my first season, 94 to 95, I won first place in the competition. And I also won the Image of the Year with a fireworks picture like this, but on film, right? So then, I was happy, obviously. I said, I'm going to enter now the Detroit exhibition. I've never entered a PSA exhibition. I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take my 4 best pictures from Detroit, including my fireworks. And there you go. First exhibition, Detroit. Guess how many acceptances I got from okay, I got 0. Like, oh my God. Even the Image of the Year didn't get accepted. Like, what is going on? Of course, I came here and I saw some amazing pictures, and good thing I didn't quit at this point. So that's it, I'm done. I'm no more 3D. Okay, so I kept it up, and I became better, and I learned a lot of things. Okay, yes.
You know what the separation was in the fireworks?
That's a very good question. It was the longest I could get. I had combined 2 bars, maybe it was 3 or 4 feet. People will tell you that's not enough. It depends on how far you are too from the fireworks. The more you can do, the better. So I didn't have the tools, so that's the most I could get. And then I kind of blow it out. I increased if you increase the focal length, you get more depth, but you get less of the fireworks in the picture. So yeah, the more you can get, the better it's going to be. Two separate tripods, whatever it takes to separate them more. I have to tell you something about the flowing water. You know, you've seen pictures like this, right, where the water looks milky. That's achieved using a slower shutter speed. But if you attempt to do it, you will realize that you have a problem. And here's the problem. Let's say it's a sunny day. Let's say it's a sunny day. So you go there and you put the lowest ISO your camera offers, let's say 100. The smallest up, because you're trying to cut the exposure down because you want to use a lot of time. So you put the smaller aperture, the slow sensitivity, and then the sunny day rule tells you need 1/60th of a second. But I want a second. I want one to blur the water. So how am I going to get this on the camera? It's not even an option. That's where you might think it's only possible using neutral density filter. The gray, all thing it does exposure, nothing else. Some cameras have the filters built in. I don't know if they really have filters or they attenuate the exposure. I used to have one camera like that. And you know, if you use one of those filters in a city and people are moving and cars are moving, they will all disappear in an exposure of 5 minutes because only the things that were staying in place will expose. Okay, next. Now, here's my last question. Can I use my camera in fully automatic mode? And my answer is, let me introduce you to this wonderful piece of technology, the Lumix 3D1. How many in this room have this camera? Well, I thought everybody does by now, no? Okay, so this camera is a nice camera, but there's a problem. When used in 3D, it can only be used in auto mode. You have no option at all. I don't know why the Panasonic engineers did that. They're like, oh, you're doing 3D, then you're not deciding on anything. Well, I don't know. Okay, so I use the camera and I like it because the spacing is short and I can take close up. And I've taken a lot of good pictures, but there are 3 things that bother me, right? The first is there is no shutter speed control. Let me show you an example with the Vini going the trails. Now look at this picture. I put the camera on the ground. I was very happy, but then I look at it and his face is a little bit blurred. It's not sharp enough. And I focus, I mean, everything else in the same depth level is sharp. He moved though, he's not sharp enough. So then I'm looking at the data. Let's see what the camera did. As I said, I have no control. When I go home, I look and I said, see, the camera used f3.9. That's the widest aperture the camera has. Okay, perfect. That's what I want. But then it used a shutter speed of 1/100 and an ISO of 100. If I had control, I would raise the shutter speed to 250 or 500 and raise the ISO to balance the exposure. There's no need to be at 100 when I'm trying to stop Vini, okay? Now, by the way, I played with this camera. It turns out that the Panasonic, it will always have the fixed at f3.9, and if there is light, if it's a sunny day, it will use 1/800. Then this is 4 steps below sunny day, so kind of a shade. And then if you have less light, it will keep dropping the shutter speed. 150, 1/25, it will make things worse for you. And then it will start rising the ISO. This is what the camera thinks you want to do, and you have no control over the camera. Next, you can turn the lights on now because I don't have any more one light. Not this, was it the one in the back? The other thing that I wish I could change with this camera is the white balance. Can you turn this light off? Or let me tell you something. For years, I've been trying to photograph fall, okay? The nice warm colors of fall. And I've been always disappointed. Like I come home, I saw this beautiful, nice warm sea, and the camera would give me this. And I was so frustrated. I was thinking, you know what? I'm gonna use warming filters. This is what I'm missing. I need to go and buy warming filters to put in front of the camera. No. The answer is all I need to do is take the camera out of auto white balance. Why? Because it's like auto exposure. The camera doesn't know. The camera looks at this and says, wait, this is too warm. Maybe it's tungsten lights at home. The camera doesn't know. So I'm gonna throw some blue in it. to make it neutral color. But no, I don't want neutral color. I want this, right? So to get this, all you need is to change from auto white, and you can use daylight. If you use daylight, you're going to get something like this. I have a friend, a photographer, that says to me, you know, George, when we use film, we always use daylight film, right? And nobody ever complained that the color outside shooting in nature was fine. Nobody wanted all the white balance, right? So why don't we use a digital camera in daylight setting, okay? Now, most cameras have a daylight, and then they have something called cloudy and something called shade. It turns out when it's a cloudy day, so here is your sun here in midday. It has a temperature of whatever, the color of the light is measured by a temperature scale. It's right here. If it's a cloudy day, that means the sun is blocked, but the sky which is blue illuminates the scene, so the scene looks a little bit bluish. And if you're in the shade, now you don't see the sun, but you see all the blue sky, so the scene tends to be very blue. So when you set your camera on cloudy day, it's going to move this point up here, so everything below here is going to look warmer, and this will look white. And if you put under shade here, it will make this white, so everything will look warmer on this side. So basically what I'm trying to say, if you use daylight, you're going to get something. If you use a cloudy, it will be warmer. And if you use shade, it will be even more warm. The Fuji only has shade. I wish it cloudy, because cloudy has become my favorite color balance setting. Now, I have to tell you something. When you go home, you can change the balance. You can go in a photo editing program and change. And if you're shooting raw images, then you don't even worry about the balance. The color balance instead of the processing when the JPEG file is created, not when the picture is recorded. But one danger is if you go home and you see this picture, you might just delete it. Say, I don't like it. But if you see this, you might say, ooh, look at this nice warm color. You want to keep it. See, this is the danger. You don't get a good idea of what you photograph. Next. Oh, the last thing that I don't like about the Panasonic is we found a way with the Fuji to use an external flash where we block the flash from the Fuji, but infrared goes through and figured a slave flash, and then we can use an external flash. Well, with the Panasonic, because you cannot control the exposure, this is not going to work. For this to work, you need to be able, then the flash will determine the exposure. Maybe you set it in an F8 automatic mode, then you need to set your camera at F8, and with the Panasonic, you don't know what's happening. With the Fuji, you can do that. Next. Oh, and talking about automated cameras, I thought those phones, the phone, very few people have tried to change. You can change things on a phone. You need to download an app, and you can change the shutter speed, the aperture, the sensitivity, the color balance. You can change all these things. Well, nobody ever does. Nobody really cares, really. It seems that the phones have better computer power behind them, and they only give you the pictures that you like to see. Okay, next. Well, Google this, because I have one or two apps and I rarely use them, so I really don't have experience. So you can Google what's the best camera app for a phone. See what comes up. I have to tell you about my full frame camera. When I got this camera here, the first day I went out taking pictures, I come back and all the backgrounds were out of focus. I was used to use the P mode, P program mode, my camera. So when I got this, I put the P mode. I went out taking pictures. I come back, and all the backgrounds are out of focus. What's going on? I look, and the camera used the widest aperture of the lens because the light was low. It was using f2.0. Then I realized, back to the drawing board. This is when I said, well, it's time to learn photography again. And that's what inspired my entire presentation. I had to go back and say, what's the best mode for this camera? And I decided aperture priority. I need f8 to control the depth of field. Then the camera has something called a minimum shutter speed. I put at 1/125 to make sure I can hold it. The ISO is variable, and all those settings here. I like to use the camera vertically because the lenses are close to my eyes. I saved all the settings in one, and when I put those cameras back to dial one, all my settings come out. Occasionally, if I need shutter control, I go to shutter priority with this camera. And occasionally I use auto. Occasionally, you should always try out of curiosity. What is the camera? What will the camera do in fully automatic mode? I don't know. It might be better than what you're trying to do. Okay. Okay. I think I complete my presentation. And a quick summary: we learned about the exposure triangle, the three variables that control exposure, right? The aperture, shutter speed, and sensitivity. We also learned that those variables control other things: the depth of field, the motion blur, and the noise in the picture. The exposure balance is how do you set those three variables to get correct exposure. Today, most people don't worry about exposure because most cameras are using auto exposure mode. And the camera, and if you use a compact camera, the aperture has become relatively unimportant. There's a mode dial, and instead of using the camera always in auto, start thinking about changing to something else. Now, my flow diagram is if I need to control the shutter speed, and I show you examples of action, of blowing water, of fireworks, whatever, a lot of situations. I need to control the shutter speed. I go under standard priority. If I don't care about the shutter speed and I use the Fuji or the Scopa cameras, I use P, program mode, instead of auto. But if I do care, if my big zone is now, I tend to go to aperture priority. Well, that's it. I don't know. I hope you learned something. Did you learn anything?